Hi, my name is Emily Bates and I'm really excited about the following interview with Managing Director at Buttress Architects Gavin Sorby, discussing how the industry needs to transform to overcome the challenges faced by recladding hundreds of tower block buildings post-Grenfell Tower tragedy. So moving on to question 1. The financing of recladding is a principal concern when the Building Safety Fund does not always apply. Mortgage companies are reluctant and insurance companies are increasing premiums or removing covers for buildings below regulation standard. So how can the industry work collectively to overcome these financial constraints to ensure residents' safety?
The first point to make here is that it's not just one industry. There are a number of industries that all need to set aside their self-interests and work together towards a satisfactory conclusion. We need engagement and a more proactive approach from lenders, insurance companies, designers, contractors, materials testers, and local authorities and planning officers. Firstly, we need to make sure that the work we're looking to do is actually necessary and is not just being blindly demanded without any real understanding of the risks. We need to understand whether the work's required because of a risk to life or a risk to property. Are we trying to save lives here or protect insurance companies from paying out claims? If work is required to protect life, then clearly it's got to be done and there will be a cost. There's a whole host of reasons why the work may be required, and unravelling that, frankly, is time-consuming and costly. And there may actually be nobody at fault. The work could have complied when it was built with the regulations current at the time. If there are costs, I don't actually believe they should be passed on to tenants through a service charge, not unless rents are adjusted to compensate for this. I think the government has acted sensibly and legislated to protect life. And the issue of funding has arisen because, unlike most changes to building regulations, this one is retrospective. Funders and insurance companies are inherently risk averse, and they've massively overreacted, in my view, and moved to mitigate their costs and risk. The pendulum is yet to come and rest in a sensible place, I think. The government has recently introduced guidance on the use of the EWS1 forms to try and bring some sense to this, but it's too soon to see if this will have an effect. I know there are funders requiring existing buildings to be brought up to current regulation standards when the EWS1 doesn't require this. It requires a reasonable level of fire safety to be achieved. There are funders requiring these forms for the purchase of properties that are simply outside the scope of the form. New building regulations will make buildings less combustible. This doesn't necessarily mean that existing buildings are unsafe. Some common sense must prevail. I'm seeing apartments that may be worth £250,000 requiring perhaps £15,000 spending on remedial work, and they're being valued at nil by valuers, which is clearly nonsense. Cash sales are proceeding on the basis of a suitably adjusted valuation, but funders' lack of understanding or lack of interest, or maybe they don't care, it is causing many owners to become financially trapped. It's not just the institutions that need some self-awareness. Designers, planners, materials testers, contractors, managing agents, they would all benefit from some. And I think if COVID has taught us anything, it's that we are all in this together. We may not be in the same boat, but we're all in the same storm. So we need to act together to get past this hurdle.
In an ideal world, how would the 0/low interest loan scheme help support tenants and owners fund the works? And do you think this is feasible in the current economic climate?
Purchasing property, whether it's a detached house or an apartment, comes with a risk. My own view is that the costs of any remedial works should be borne by the freehold owners or long leaseholders and not by the tenants. If the freehold owners cannot afford to pay, then the government should step in and fund, but place a charge on the property. This could be either paid back over time, like an interest-free loan, or clipped from the proceeds of sale. The current economic climate, in my view, I don't think is a relevant factor. I think there would never be a good time to fund these works for anybody concerned. We just need to get it done now.
As a practice, what are the most appropriate remedial approaches to deal with ACM and HPL panels, zinc and copper cladding on plywood, and insulated render systems that are both economic and environmentally sustainable?
In the UK, we have only a limited choice of materials that have been tested to the new requirements currently, and there are no magic answers. Each building is unique and it needs to be assessed on its own merits. We've replaced ACM panels, zinc and copper cladding, HPL cladding, insulated render systems, and there are materials available. They are subtly different in appearance and the way they perform. It's not a simple swap in and swap out. There's some intelligence goes behind this. We can't afford to make the same mistakes that were made before. What we do now has got to be right.
If the UK market has not yet matured, and thus options can be limited, particularly concerning matching planning purposes, is there any international best practice examples that we could learn from?
Maybe other materials available internationally, but most manufacturers are working across international markets in any case. So the materials we have available here are also abroad. The issue, I think, is that we don't have that many materials yet tested in the UK. So this, I think, will become increasingly the case now that Brexit is done. So manufacturers need to get their materials tested, and then we'll have a greater range to go at.
The industry has a responsibility to ensure the safety of the population. Which primary actors need to improve their communication to ensure we do not repeat history? How can this be done, and why do you believe there is a lack of substantial communication between them?
The construction industry is driven by money and risk, and the desire to shift that financial risk onto others whilst achieving the lowest cost. There's currently no one party central to the whole process who is in a position to ensure the original design intent is carried through to contract, construction and completion. The whole process has become fragmented, with fees then being paid to people who make it appear joined up. If we consider the construction process like a foreign holiday, we've abandoned the experienced tour operator who had a view of everything and handled everything. And instead, we've asked people who have been on holiday once or twice to arrange a host of separate companies, each handling a small element of the trip for the lowest cost and with no knowledge or interest in any of the other parts. It shouldn't then be a surprise if a taxi from the airport has got no seatbelts or that the breakfast is inedible. It's a strange analogy, perhaps, but it's not far off what's happened. And we've abandoned the traditional role of the architect who provided that golden thread that Dame Hackett refers to in her report. We should also put the risk for what is done back with those that are responsible for the building, the owners. It's they who are commissioning the work. They are responsible for what is done. And we should not be trying to pass that along to the parties who are doing the work. They should remain responsible for what they have done and the quality of what they have done and doing what they have done correctly. But actually deciding what it is that is to be done should stay with the building owners, in my view.
So moving on to the last but not least question in this interview. Do you think the industry does enough in terms of building beautifully, design codes and building regulations and standards?
Design and construction are getting ever more complicated. But in my view, legislation and regulation is the only thing that will force a change. There are good and bad regulations and standards, and different ways that they can be interpreted. The changes now in Part L and corresponding changes in Part F will kickstart a move from gas to electricity and a move to using less energy rather than zero carbon. That would otherwise just not happen, and that regulation is good. Conversely, we have a project seriously delayed because the roof build-up has got 10 millimetres more insulation than it was. Common sense says it will be fine. Instead, we've got to spend £80,000 and 10 weeks of delay to decide that it's okay. And it was. That's an example of a bad regulation, in my view. Some common sense should still be applied, but there is a fear of applying any sort of common sense now where fire safety is concerned. Understandable, But I think the pendulum, as I've said previously, needs to come back to a sensible place. Building beautifully, I think, is a whole other board game, and nothing to do with regulations, codes, or standards. Those are just the rules of the game. How you play it is how you get a beautiful building or not. Sadly, not everybody can dance. I think beauty for many is synonymous with quality, and it's become a tick box exercise of things that you can measure. But I think for me, it's a far more subjective thing that is more related to emotions. I think you should have another conversation about beauty at a separate time.
I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Gavin for his time and expertise. It is evident that significant steps still need to be taken to overcome these challenges faced by these projects, but I hope the industry does indeed evolve in this manner, providing promise in a post-Grenfell world.